All right, so tonight our theme is race, scholarship, and activism. And this theme is multifaceted. For starters, it probes the question of the value of scholarship and whether or not scholarship is kinetic at all. Second, it addresses the questions of many scholars of color, in particular, whether their intellectual contributions are of value to marginalized communities. And finally, it interrogates the issue of what constitutes valuable scholarship. So to talk about this, we have a wonderful interdisciplinary panel of scholars who have both exemplified keen scholarship and have also been active in their communities. So I'm going to start at the end and work my way towards me. So first is Dr. Tehama Lopez Bunyasi. She is Assistant Professor of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. She got her PhD in Political Science at the University of Chicago. And before that, she worked as the Community Affairs Assistant at the Southern Poverty Law Center, where her coalition building with stakeholders across Alabama in the wake of the September 11th attacks led to the creation of the state's first hate crimes unit. Her research lays at the intersection of race and politics in the United States, with specializations in structural inequality, racial marginalization, racial attitudes and ideologies, and the politics of whiteness. She recently published a book with Candace Watts-Smith, which is called Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter, and it's for sale outside. And this book intervenes in the messy and contentious area about public discourse of race in order to guide the average non-academic through the structural and ideological mechanisms of contemporary American racism. In addition to her teaching and academic writings, Dr. Lopez Bunyasi provides dialogue and helps to promote dialogue across controversial matters of inequality by contributing commentary to a variety of media outlets, including the New York Times, PBS, C-SPAN, NBC News Latino, and Voice of America. Her scholarship has been recognized and supported by the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, the Samuel Du Bois Cook Postdoctoral Fellowship at Duke, and the Ford Foundation. Next to her is Dr. David Crockett, who is professor of marketing at the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. He earned his PhD in marketing with a minor in sociology from the University of Arizona, and he previously taught at Marquette University and held a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard. Dr. Crockett is also an active member of the Columbia, South Carolina chapter of Black Lives Matter. His primary research interests are in the sociological aspects of consumer behavior, particularly the consequences of social inequality. His research investigates the creation, manifestation, and resolution of class, gender, and racial inequality in the marketplace, and addresses consumer, managerial, and public policy initiatives designed to alleviate inequality. He's also interested in health-related policy and social enterprise. His research has appeared in the Journal of Consumer Research, the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, the Journal of Business Research, the Journal of Consumer Culture, the Journal of Research for Consumers, the American Marketing Science Review, the Journal of Macro Marketing and Preventive Medicine. Next to him is Dr. Lisa Woolfolk. She's Associate Professor of English at the University of Virginia and co-director of the University Center for the Liberal Arts. She's a specialist in African American literature and culture. Her book, Embodying American Slavery and Contemporary Culture, was published by the University of Illinois Press in 2008. In addition, her work concerns televisual representations. So she's written about True Blood, All in the Family, The Jeffersons, and she also teaches a popular course on not just the book, but also the television show Game of Thrones. In the summer of 2017, Dr. Woolfolk became a founding member of Black Lives Matter Charlottesville. This group protested against the white supremacist insurgency that had taken hold of the city during the Summer of Hate, and she was on the ground during the events of August 11th and 12th in a variety of capacities, including nonviolent direct action, working with the Bail Fund, sewing for a creative arts team, and co-founding an anti-racist media collective. She has an essay called This Class of Persons, When UVA's White Supremacist Past Meets Its Future, which was published in a 2018 collection of essays about the terror events of Charlottesville written by UVA professors, which is also available outside. She also contributes op-eds to the Huffington Post, CNN, and the Washington Post. Next to her is Dr. Rafael Solorzano. He is an assistant professor of social justice in the Department of Chicano and Latino Studies at Cal State Los Angeles. He's a social movement historian whose teaching interests include Chicanx and Latinx history, racial geographies, and queer of color critique. He earned his PhD in Chicano Studies at UCLA with an emphasis on gender studies and is part of UCLA's first graduating cohort in Latino Studies. Born and raised behind the orange curtain of Orange County, California, Dr. Solorzano has been a racial justice advocate for over 20 years, where he's been a part of many campaigns designed to counter racial violence, achieve educational justice, and end the school to prison to deportation pipeline. This past year, he has supported the grassroots and anti-deportation campaigns called ICE Chasers, led by the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights, and currently consults with the national organization Familia, a trans queer liberation movement. At UCLA, he was a Eugene Cotarrobles Fellow. You may also recognize him because he was a fellow at the James Weldon Johnson Institute last year. So his research agenda is to write racial justice history by documenting coalition efforts that center the most marginalized in society in the U.S. South. His current book project, called Trail of Dreams, Forging New Visions of Migrant Justice, documents the political ingenuity led by undocumented youth across the Trail of Dreams, a 4-month, 1,500-mile walk from Miami to Washington, D.C. in 2010. He has forthcoming articles in Latino Studies and a chapter in the forthcoming book, Queer and Trans Migrations, Dynamics of Illegalization. He's also currently developing a Chicana feminist animation video series.
Wow, that's great.
And last but not least is Dr. Khalilah Brown-Dean, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Quinnipiac University and a former faculty coordinator of the Health Policy and Advocacy Concentration at the Frank H. Netter School of Medicine. With a keen eye towards the practical implications of democratic conflict, her research interests center on voting rights, race election administration, and public policy. She's the author of Identity Politics in the United States, which is available outside for purchase. This book moves beyond the headlines to show how conflicts over group identity are an inescapable feature of American political development and provides prescriptions for erasing inequality. She's published numerous academic and popular pieces, including a co-authored report on the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies that was presented during the 50th anniversary celebration of the Bloody Sunday March in Selma, Alabama. Dr. Brown-Dean's analysis has appeared in over 400 media outlets, including the New York Times, Fox News Radio, NPR, Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera, and The Hill. She works with scholars, legislators, community organizations, and activists to center the experiences of victims and their families within criminal justice reform efforts. She is featured in the documentaries The Color of Justice and Extinction, and was recognized by Diverse Magazine as one of the top 25 women in higher education. Dr. Brown-Dean is chair of the board of directors for the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven, one of the oldest and largest community foundations in the nation, and has held appointed and elected positions in various organizations, including the American Political Science Association and the National Association for Ethnic Studies. So please join me in welcoming our panel. So oftentimes when I start these panels, we usually kind of get into the heart of research and definitions, but I think this topic actually merits a more personal question. So I'd like to ask each of you, why did you decide to pursue a PhD? So whoever wants to jump in first. Rafa.
I'll go ahead and begin. So I kind of took the non-traditional PhD route. I worked for 15, 20 years before I started my PhD program at UCLA. And what ended up happening was I had been working already for like 15 years in racial justice, educational justice, migrant rights, organizing all throughout California, specifically addressing some of the issues that were brought by No Child Left Behind, right, educational policy. So I was doing that in undocumented youth spaces and also doing that within queer spaces. And so in 2008, 2009, 2010, I started getting involved with the undocumented youth movement while I was actually Orange County Commissioner for the county, and also my city a human relations commissioner also for my city. And so I was kind of like, at this time, my early 30s. And so I'm like the elder in the room and sharing kind of like my perspective of how to do like intergenerational coalition building. And so if you remember 2010 was a big push to pass the DREAM Act. And in 2010, you had multiple like civil disobedience actions, one being, yes, the Trail of Dreams, but the other one was like the McCain sit-in, hunger strikes all across the United States, led by undocumented youth. And so I had become great friends and colleagues with this like young cohort of activists that were like queer and who were women. And actually after like 2011, they were like, oh, I'm going back to school. So unlike Georgia, depending on like when you access K to 12th education, you're able, and you're undocumented, you're able to access higher education. You can get, at that time, well, not yet, you couldn't get state grants. Now you can, but you can attend university and college and pay in-state tuition instead of international fees, right? So that was California. And so I had a lot of friends who had just like, had been organizing for the documented youth movement, were like, I'm going back to get my master's, or I'm gonna go back and get my PhD. And literally, they inspired me. And I was like, man, I have tons of privilege as a person who's a citizen, and I need to like up my skills, right? So I had already been in the movement for 15 years. I had already worked in grassroots nonprofits, public policy. I had worked for the county. I had worked for a foundation. So I was like, okay, I need to start shaping policy or ideas somewhere else. And so that's when I started thinking about going back to get my PhD. And so also being introduced to scholar activism wasn't anything new for me, because in 1999, when I was a student at UC Berkeley, I was part of the Third World Liberation Front that was fighting to keep ethnic studies at Berkeley. And so my experience around, holding to an ethnic studies department, right? Or in this case, like Chicana X, Latinx studies, was early on, like I was 21, where I began to understand, right, what role ethnic studies had in universities like, say, UC Berkeley, and also what it means to win a campaign, to keep it. And so I was part of that, and that really influenced and shaped the way I see what does it look like for universities to fully invest in ethnic studies, to fully invest in like a Center for Race and Gender Studies, or also to invest in like a multiracial community center that has ties to the community. And so I've always carried that with me. And so when I went back to get my PhD program, I really wanted to replicate those things.
So I still ask myself that question, like today. Why did I do this? And I've now been a professor for 16 years. So I'm a first-generation college student. What I knew was that my mom and dad always told me, we've worked really hard to provide this opportunity for you. Now you go become a lawyer so you can make a lot of money and we don't have to worry about you, right? So fun fact, Professor Gillespie and I were actually students together at the University of Virginia. I was a year ahead of her, but we had classes together. So I went to college to become an attorney because that's what I knew. When I went back home to my small town, people could understand that, oh, I'm studying this so that I could become this. It wasn't until a week before my last year of college that I called and told my parents, I'm going into a PhD program. Because Andra, Tehama, and I had all done this program called the Ralph Bunche Summer Institute to get more students of color within the field of political science. But for that program, I wouldn't be here today as a professor of political science. So that question of why I decided to do it, I knew I had interest in law, politics, pop culture, and policy, and I didn't know how to really define it. But what I also knew was that when I called and told my dad I'm getting a PhD in political science, he was so disappointed because he thought that meant I wanted to be a politician, right? And he was like, why would you do that? Yeah. So it's harder to then, and I think people talk about the imposter syndrome of what it's like to be a person of color in a predominantly white space, what it is to be a gender non-binary person in a predominantly cisgendered space, which is what the academy is. For me, the imposter syndrome was to come back to my small hometown and people say, "Are you done yet?
Yeah.
What's next?" And the PhD program doesn't really work like that. They understood law school. You've got 3 years, you're in and you're out. They didn't understand this. Maybe if your committee supports it, you get to move forward. So a lot of what I did as a graduate student, what I do now as a professor and as a scholar, is trying to amplify those voices in those spaces. Let's not take it for granted that the stipend that some students sort of thumb their noses to, other people are taking parts of that and sending it back home because it's a steady check for people month to month. And I think that really shaped what I wanted to do in the academy, but also how I wanted to redefine my role as a professor.
Others? Okay, this is on. So it's a natural flow for me to then talk about, as also a fellow of the Ralph Bunche Summer Institute. I was always told that it was my cohort that was the first that entered non-Black students, and I don't that history got kind of challenged over the summer, but maybe the second group or so.
I want to say Carmen was a year ahead of you.
And so I had no idea that a PhD was something that was within grasp logistically for me. I think I knew I had the curiosity that was probably required to go do that thing, but what steps does it take? And I'm not a first generation college student. In fact, my parents are both public school teachers, but they stopped there. That's right. They have a bachelor's degree. So to understand higher ed and to know that you could go there and that there was this thing called tuition remission, and that there was a stipend that whole set of information was not something that I had at all until, a Black mentor, and I had been mentored by Black people only in undergraduate school, said, this is something that you could do. And let me show you the logistics of how that could be possible. And then it was like, oh, right. So ever since education is something in my family that people do professionally, I thought, wow, this is something I could do in this other realm, right? And I could also ask questions and when I saw people who were PhDs, who were using that position really of power to use it to bring back to the communities, I was like, oh, this is exciting, right? And so when I went to graduate school, it was Melissa Harris Perry who became my mentor there. And the kind of work we did in Chicago with the high school students, and I was like, oh, this just all became very real to me. Like, that's something maybe I could do. It was the modeling for me. It was telling me you could. Otherwise, my thought was like, I want to just contribute to society in some positive way. And that was all I knew in college. Yeah.
Yours is probably much more interesting, so I want to hear yours.
Oh, mine is not that interesting at all. I was a nerd, and I loved school, and it was something I was really good at. And then I didn't have any marketable skills. And so I realized that I love reading, I love books, and looking back on it now, I was incredibly naive as an undergraduate because I didn't really understand how someone became a professor. I didn't understand how that happened. I didn't understand that you could have your job actually be teaching books. And I was like, that could be a good-ass job. I think I should do that for my job. And so I ended up finding, there was a woman who had taught at my undergraduate institution, which was a small women's college in Boston called Simmons College, which is now called Simmons University now. And I was like, well, when did that happen? I got to check my email more. But it's at Simmons College. And so I went to graduate school and worked with her. This was Dr. Nellie McKay, who was my mentor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I ended up getting my PhD, only to learn that I was like the first Black person to get a PhD in English at the University of Wisconsin. That's what I said, right? This was not, I didn't get my PhD in 1952. I got my PhD in 2000. There was the internet. The idea that you could have a Black person doing something for the first time in 2000, doesn't that seem ridiculous? And so, and you talk about the program, the Ralph Bunche Summer Institute, which I've made a note of. I was able to get to graduate school through a program called the Institute for the Recruitment of Teachers, the IRT. I was in the second class of the IRT. I was there in 1991. The program started in 1990. I was in that second class. And it's really funny now because I'm telling my own son about it. You know, and like the idea, and I'm going to do whatever I can, I will tell you that right now, to make sure my son gets in that program. Considering like that, I have a video of myself on the program website. So I think they owe me a little bit of something, right. You know, for being one of the first persons to get the PhD and be a professor. But anyway, he's also super smart, so he doesn't need me. But I mean, this idea of like, how do you learn this information? You know, so much of this is like hidden. So much of this is, you know, it seems Byzantine. You know, it was really very fortunate. And when I applied to the program, I didn't get in at first. And then I met with Kelly Wise, who was the director. And he was like, we just got some more funding. If you want to come, you could come. And I came and I ended up applying to a bunch of different graduate schools. They taught me about what graduate school would be like. They help you to develop confidence and poise in a classroom, to defend your positions. All of these are things that I continue to do today in my own teaching. You know, like a student will say, well, I'm not sure. I say, stop right there. Don't apologize before you even say anything, right? If you are wrong, I'll tell you that I think you're wrong, right? But don't begin with this hesitation. You know, audition ideas, see how it goes, change your mind, be willing to have your mind changed by somebody else. But don't begin with caveats, right? No one here is demanding perfection, right? This is a process, and we're all engaged in intellectual labor. And we're gonna say some things that don't make sense, and that's fine. But we're not gonna apologize for them, we're gonna claim them. You know, and so that was like one of these things that I learned, you know, from my time at IRT. And so I mentioned that because had it not been for that different set of circumstances, things might have turned out very differently. So I think these kind of programs are really important.
So I can give a very brief version. So much like the other stories that you've heard here, this is about institutional interventions and interpersonal ones, right? Like that's basically how everybody gets a PhD, you know, at the end of the day. You know, for me, I picked marketing in large part because my mom is a Tuskegee graduate in nursing. And so she was like, you're going to be a doctor, right? And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. So I just kind of picked business on a humbug, you know, because like if you say business, then your parents stop bothering you. And so so I picked that. But I had these radical politics, and it basically has it took me my whole life up until getting into a PhD program to find a way to marry those two things, right? They don't naturally go together, as it turns out. And I started an MBA after my undergraduate degree in marketing. I started an MBA mostly because I had sort of discovered marketing research, and I was like, research sounds interesting, but I was thinking of like professional research, like into products and things like that. And so, you know, that's what I was kind of setting myself up to do by getting this MBA. And, you know, I just sort of happened upon a course where the prof kind of pulled me to the side one day and said, have you considered a career in academics? You kind of sound like an academic. And I said, what's academics? And so he said, well, why don't you come up to my office and, you know, we'll have a chat about it. And my half of that conversation went like, so wait a minute. You're telling me, and this was for you Wisconsin people, at the University of Wisconsin, Whitewater, which is the size of this room. So my professor at Whitewater said, yeah, they pay me to write these papers. And I said, well, how do they pick what papers you're gonna write? He's like, oh, no, I write what I wanna write. All right, wait a minute. You have a job where they pay you to come to sit in here when you're not teaching class and you just write about stuff that you wanna write about? How can I be down?
Yeah, right.
Like, so that was pretty much it. And so he helped me find,
yes, right?
You know, some programs. I applied to 7 PhD programs and I got into Arizona. And so I packed up my stuff in my little car, and once I hit New Mexico, I was like, these are cacti, like on the Roadrunner cartoon.
Oh, my
It
goodness.
looks like that. And then I got to Tucson, and I didn't see another Black person for 3 weeks.
So I have to ask, and so this is kind of open, so feel free to jump in, or if not, that's okay. Why a PhD program, especially for people who want to be community-minded, and all of you are community-oriented? Khalilah has kind of addressed the question of why not law school for her, but why not a public policy degree? Why not a master's degree in teaching, for instance? Why the PhD?
So from a very practical perspective, it means something when I walk into a room of legislators that I want to understand how, when we talk about criminal justice reform, we have to center the voices of victims. They take me much more seriously when it has doctor in front of it.
Yeah.
And I'm not a person who, if you meet me, I'll tell you, hi, I'm Khalilah. But when I walk into those spaces where the presumption is that I'm not supposed to be there, I lead with that title. And I lead with that credential. Because what I understand is what I'm about to say is no different, is no more powerful than the woman whose son was gunned down, but no one covered the story because they dismissed that as an urban narrative. We're saying the same thing. But I understand that in this country, those kind of credentials matter in different ways. And I also, for me, it's an act of resistance, right? I understand that I chair a board that administers $500 million. I understand that money was made by people who never imagined that a little brown girl with a big Arabic name would be the person deciding how to allocate that funding. So it's not that you can't do it with other degrees. I just knew for what I wanted to accomplish, having that credential was going to mean something different. But it also, and the reality is, it's also created a challenge. Because for some people, when they hear the credential PhD, they assume that you have no concept of the world beyond your classroom.
That's the problem, yeah.
So straddling that divide between what we want to do and what the communities we serve believe we can do, because there have been a lot of people who have messed it up for us and made it more difficult for us and treated communities as if they are just research projects, as opposed to people who can tell you what they need instead of you having to impose that. So I think a lot of us fight against that on different fronts.
And I just wanted to add, just on the same frame as Professor Brown-Dean, this notion for me that there's a distinction between the real world and the academic world is not a world that I, as a Black woman, have ever been allowed to live in. That these are always permeable boundaries, right? There's no way, no matter what I was doing, whether I had a master's and decided to go on and do a master's in teaching and work K-12, if I decided to, get a degree in public policy, all of these other options, politics, whatever I might have chosen, there's a certain way that Black folks are treated in this country, regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of your cultural position, that reminds you of the limitations forced upon you by white supremacist patriarchal capitalism. Right? These are things, this is just facts of the life in which we live. And so I really reject, this critique that you just brought up, where, professors live in an ivory tower. I'm like, maybe some professors do still live that way. There are some who do live that way. I am not one of them. And the people that I am in community with, my colleagues, don't live like that. We have family members in prison. We have, kids that we worry about riding home on the school bus or walking home alone. I just locked my door for, I live in a little tiny town. I just locked my door for the first time last night because I was like, oh, cops. I'm not leaving this fucking door open. It's cops. Who knows? A cop might come in here when we're not looking and kill us. These are the things that I think about, and I do not believe that any ivory tower professor thinks that. It makes me wonder who is being served by that dichotomy. Who benefits from that dichotomy? Because I do not believe it to be us. So.
Going back to that question, why the PhD? And so I'm the newest, I'm the baby in this row, right? They've been, but but like we're the same age group though, because we've all been around. And for me, I continue to think about why the PhD. And for me, it's been even a process, right? Like I shared with you my story. I was working for 15, 20 years. And by 15, 20 years, I'm like, I already have a sense of myself. I already have a sense of my priorities, my family, my desires, everything, right? Like I got it to a T, right? So it's just like, I'm going to do my PhD, I'm going to graduate like in 4 and 5. Okay, that did happen, but even within my PhD program, like I was still negotiating like, okay, what type of like scholar or community organizer do you want to be, Rafa? Like, how are you really going to give back? Like this article you're thinking about putting like in this book chapter, like how is that helping anybody? Like how is that changing kind of like the power dynamics? How is that like really centering the voices of like of women of color, of undocumented Mexican women or US? Those things to me, like I'm always thinking about, and so I say this, it's been a process because I feel even right now that I'm teaching my first classes, like I'm continuing to learn, to push myself to be like, okay, how am I making this class connected to the community right now? Right. And so and even like just this summer, I learned this, or not learned this, but it became so like in my face and so clear. So I just want to give props to this organization right here, GLAR, Georgia's Latinos Alliance for Human Rights, who's been getting down in Georgia for migrant rights, trying to fight to end 287G, abolish prisons, detention centers. And I say this because this summer, there was a campaign that GLAR launched to stop 287G contracts in different counties in Georgia. And I remember I would go to these commissioner hearings to give comments, right, about like why they should not extend the contract. And so we all would go. We would all who ride that space, and it'd be like 20 of us. Everybody would give their testimony. I would go give my testimony, and then I would say the credentials. Dr. Rafael Solorzano, right? Because like I had just defended like a week before. So I was like my first time to publicly say that. At the end of my testimony, right, we were done. One of the commissioners comes up to me, he's like, I want to talk to you. Not to the victims whose families have been separated, not to the young children who have parents who've been separated, but to me because of my credentials. And there's like, I want to talk to you because I want to do a forum, and I think you should be part of this forum. Right? And so to me, also, again, I say this because, it's still a process, and I know that when I come into these spaces, I also take space. And so I have to always be aware of like, kind of inverting that. It's like, oh no, you don't want me on your panel. You want these organizers on your panel.
Exactly. Share the mic.
Yeah. So I'm going to get back to power dynamics later. And Tehama, I'm happy to start with you. You kind of brought this idea up of having questions, and that's sort of a good sign that you should go to graduate school. So if you have no questions, then you shouldn't go to graduate school. But what's a useful question, particularly for scholars of color and particularly for people who care about real world, real life issues? So does all research have to be applied or contemporary to be useful? So for instance, if somebody wanted to study 19th century Victorian literature, for instance, is that a useful academic endeavor that we should encourage people to do?
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes because the people who I know who actually study that kind of subject matter, right, or study like Melville, right, like
Melville especially.
Melville especially, but like to a lot of people, they're thinking, okay, this is like a white dude, right,
And a whale.
And with this, what does this mean? Does it mean, but to then put the whole like race lens and like, when people start talking about colonialism, like, I mean, Victorian anything is not absent of those kind of power dynamics. So the people are doing great work around that. And I think that, kind of towards that like, contemporary past binary, like the past is always with us. So I feel like all these questions are really useful. But I think it is in your analysis, the question could be plentiful, it could be bountiful. What you're going to do with that question, how you're going to answer that question, what you're going to apply your analysis in the direction of, I think is where maybe we, are you navel gazing, or is this going to be helpful to another person? processing, some other related issue. I think that for me is like, that's where the greatest value comes from, other than, okay, that's great, we know this thing, but what does it mean for us? So the questions can be whatever, but the application, the analysis, the next questions that come after it are cool. Yeah.
I'll build on that just as, quickly, because so part of my perspective is coming from a place where research in some ways is expected to be applied. Right, so I'm in a school of business, and there is a market out there. Like, someone is supposed to be able to use that stuff, and so our version of this kind of conversation is often the folks who are advocating for doing kind of basic research are in many ways in the minority. Where I'm coming from. So the dynamics are a little bit different. And so the way that I have kind of always thought about that is whatever your politics are, whatever you're working on, the truth of the matter is the answers that you're looking for are probably out there somewhere, right? Like, people you ain't the first one to have engaged whatever question has come up. But the thing is, those answers can take a variety of different forms, right? And so the person who crafted those things sometime way back when may not have known that this is going to be a way to get an answer to the question that you will ask 20 years later, right? So it's kind of like life imitates the game show Jeopardy. Sometimes what you get are the answers, and kind of why the PhD is like, I wanted to be part of crafting answers. And then maybe sometime later, the questions that go with those answers become more clear. So I'm for all of it, right? Let's do all of it. Let's do the basic stuff. Let's do the applied stuff, because the truth is, we don't know enough. We don't know nearly enough about anything. So let's get it all in and then figure it out from there.
I just want to offer one caution, too. I think sometimes the expectation within graduate programs and in the discipline is that if you are a scholar of color, you're supposed to do the race work, right?
Yes.
And then that work is called me-search, because certainly you can't be objective studying African-American politics as an African-American woman. There must be something there for you to do. And so that becomes really detrimental to your career, because there is this unfair expectation, but then it forces you to question yourselves in a way that your colleagues do not have to. So I think what is a worthwhile question is, what is the question that will satisfy your curiosity? What will sustain you to create a platform and an agenda, and understand how that will change over time. It's interesting to me, I can be a little snarky sometimes. When I presented my first dissertation proposal, a member of my committee said, why do we need to care about disenfranchisement? Those people wouldn't vote anyway.
Oh, what now?
So my dissertation, think about it, like, my dissertation was on felon disenfranchisement. And I started working on that in 2000, before the 2000 presidential election. And the idea was, look, it's me-search. You have this vested interest in understanding Black folks in their South and their voting patterns. Fast forward now, it's a different kind of landscape. So for my colleague who is African-American and studied Chinese politics, the response to her was, well, who's going to take you seriously as a Black woman speaking Chinese, studying Chinese politics? So those are the kinds of institutional disciplinary narratives that I think we have to disrupt, and also see how complicated it is, that if I want to study Congress and the impeachment, I should be able to do that without the expectation that I have to be the expert on this particular phase of it because of my identity or how others perceive my identity.
And just to add to that too, I mean, this double bind that Black women, and again, speaking as myself as a Black woman, that Black women face is that you are too biased to talk about racism, but yet you are not qualified to talk about anything else. I mean, it is just perverse, and it is this notion that basically it just goes around that white people and whiteness are neutral and can talk about anything and everything, right, without qualification. And that's, I just find that so appalling. I just want to throw in real quick that poetry is not a luxury. And that's, from Audre Lorde, and I think it's so important to kind of keep that in mind. And the things that are the esoteric is not just for the whites. If you want to do something that is, that might be seen as not, I don't know, practical or whatever, the point is to have this burning question. And if that is your question, you can choose to work hard to pursue that. And that is a form of dismantling a structure that is overwhelmingly harmful.
So you are all very active in your communities. You're active in Black Lives Matter and immigrant rights and other civil rights organizations. How do you balance your activist work with the demands in the academy, particularly the publisher parish demand?
Yeah.
I'll start. Oh, go ahead. All right, I'll start. Go ahead. Not well.
Same. Not well.
Rafa?
Oh, okay. That was a follow-up, okay.
Who balances? There's a balance? What? I'm tired all the time. Isn't that what everybody is?
So, just writing this down. So again, I want to return to the sense of self, having a sense of self, and something that I've developed over so many years, and especially when I was, as a graduate student. I think my sense of self and my priorities helped me get out of there in 4 or 5 years, and also manage all the power dynamics that exist, right? Like your chair's power over you, your department chair, everything, right? So me understanding, what was kind of like, right, the goal, right, and setting myself up for that, and then understanding what were the most important relationships to me, right, and keeping those relationships close to me. That's part of having a sense of myself, because it helped me negotiate again my personal desires, right, my family, my involvement in the community, my academic responsibilities. So for me, to prioritize these circles of friendships and people who are okay, you know what? I'm not going to really get down with my chair of my dissertation, but I'm going to get down with them. I'm prioritizing this relationship over this one, and that's a hard decision. And I think because of my age, because of my gender, and those factors, that I'm able to do that, and I know that my younger colleagues wouldn't step into that, wouldn't hurt these type of relationships. So I just also want to recognize that too. And also something that I learned a lot in doing my work with community is accountability. And I say accountability because in this work, even though I have all these other priorities of okay, I gotta get the article out, or I gotta prep for classes, or I have now these committee responsibilities, I have my accountability to the organizations that I committed to, right? Say, okay, I'll help you with your strategic plan. Okay, I'll help you by facilitating your next retreat, right? And holding that as the same type of importance. Right, I think that was really key, and being that's my part. That will shape my research, right? And not seeing it totally different.
I think this is gonna sound snarky again. Preface.
Bring on the snark.
Been a long day.
I love snark.
I believe that folks need to stay in their intellectual lane. What do I mean by that? There are people who will jump up and say yes to everything when really that's not their area. I'm a political
Give us some
scientist.
examples with some names. I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Names.
Please speak on it.
I don't need a live stream tweet, she said.
Speak on it.
At such and such.
This is just between us.
But I will give you an example without names, right? So I'm a political scientist. This is the season, the feast for us. To the point where we have to go, I just can't take it anymore. I don't need one more headline. Let me just take a little break and watch some reality TV, because the reality show of American politics is too much,
all
right?
the debates, that's all there. Okay.
But I can turn on the TV and see a person putting themselves forth as an expert on politics. And I'm like, I thought you studied such and such. That's different. So that's what I mean about staying in your intellectual lane and balancing the various roles that you play.
Yes.
I don't call myself an activist. I'm not an activist. I am someone who is very much engaged in the work of community building. I'm very much engaged in public policy, and I'm always trying to figure out how do I use those various platforms to work together to focus on the things that I care about. But for me personally, the most important role that I play is as mother. So if I know that I show up at home tired, broken, and overwhelmed because I've been to 4 committee meetings that could have been 1 email, and I've been meeting with students and fighting to understand why we have 15 administrators who have salaries bigger than the budget of my department, that's my snark, right? She doesn't deserve mommy coming home totally overwhelmed and not understanding that. So creating those boundaries are something that I'm able to do now in my life that I was not able to do when I was a junior faculty member, because I was so afraid that if I said no, that was going to be the end of my career. Or if I say no to this person, they're going to blackball me in that. And what I want to say, to keep it all the way real with you, in this work, you have to understand that there are consequences to every choice that you make. And it may be the choice for you to show up at a meeting or to show up at a discussion like this. There are consequences to that. And you have to be willing to own those consequences and to be okay with that and to define your worth. Because the reality is that institutions persist for a reason.
Right, because they don't care about you.
And people are replaceable. And if at the end of the day you build your life around an institution and an institutional identity, you are left with nothing when they decide to run to the next shiny thing.
I just wanted to throw in really quickly, what I did to balance was, again, it goes back to the not well. I was in grad school and I had a baby. So that was like instant balance. That was, I had got this little scholarship so I could pay for childcare during the times when I could also write my dissertation, And so which was great. It was a great little thing to have, but it really forced that for me. And I don't know if this is just something I was fortunate to get the job that I ultimately got, which was my first and only job at the University of Virginia. I got it straight out of grad school, is that I never thought of those people as my boss. I never thought about my department chair as my boss. I never thought about people who were senior colleagues as me as my boss. I never, which I guess I'm, touch wood, very fortunate, I never thought about them holding the keys, to whether I could do this or not do this. I tried to live as authentically as I possibly could. I realize that that's very fortunate. I believe that there's a lot of there's ugly politics at my university. There obviously are. But I am fortunate to say that either I was naive and didn't pay attention, or I was exhausted because, as I said, I had a baby and was just not paying that much attention. And I said yes to a lot of things, and I still say yes to a lot of things. And I remember coming up for tenure and being the PTO president of my son's elementary school, because this was a majority minority school, and they didn't have that much money, and I wanted to make sure we had the activities, and so I tried to push us in a different direction. And I remember talking to a friend once, and I was like, what is my legacy as a PTO president going to be? And then I was like, what kind of asshole wants to have a PTO presidential legacy? What is that? What is wrong with you? It was actually bingo night, thank you. We had a really amazing bingo night that raised more money for the school had ever had.
Probably some special brownies.
It was some special brownies. Part of my coping is my current pursuit of a prescription for miracle marijuana that I could also put in my special brownies. But it's just this notion that and I don't know if I'm trying to de-glamorize the profession or the professorate or whatever, but I feel like I'm a regular person who wants to try to do the things that my mom did for me, she taught 4th grade for almost 40 years in public school. She was out in the summer. She would sew our clothes in the summertime. My 2 cousins are here. They would come down. We would swim in the backyard and do all kind of fun stuff. And, you know, she did cake decorating. I do all those things. You can find me on Black Women Stitch on Instagram. I do all those things. And Black Women Stitch. And like, it's really about trying to live a full life. And I tell people that, like, you cannot, institutions, this University of Virginia has been around for, I think we're heading into our 200th year, I believe. And yeah, this year, our 10 into our 200th year, that school is gonna live long past me. And I don't know why I'm expected to, and I don't think anyone should be, to kind of give up their blood and life's work, soul stuff for the support of an institution. I do love my job. I like my colleagues. I like my students. I taught some really great classes. 2 years ago, I taught a class called Race, Racism, Colony, and Nation, about the links between the American Revolution and Black Lives Matter. Next semester, I'm teaching a class called Sally Hemings University, that's about breaking down this white supremacist patriarchal system through the university. What would it look like to have a university based on Black women's liberation and negotiation of a racist capitalist system? What would that look like, right? I have a feeling it would involve more than 3 full Black women professors. There are three, not me, I'm associate. There are 3 Black women professors at the full level at my school. And if it was Sally Hemings University, I think that might be different. And these are the questions we can kind of play with, right, and ask. But it seems to me that balance that people are striving for, it has to come from within. You aren't gonna know what it looks like. And I'm exhausted, y'all. I am tired all the time. And almost everybody I know is as tired as I am. And so I don't think I'm doing a great job of it, but I really feel like I've been able to kind of provide for my family, for my kids in a good way, maybe not a great way. It's not like we are like money bags or anything, but I feel like I've helped to create a life and to stand up for values that are important and that'll stand the test of time and help to make the world a different and better place.
Yeah. So just as a plug for our colloquium series, one of those UVA Black Women Foals will be here in the spring for our colloquium, Deborah McDowell.
Yes, Debbie's coming. Yes, she's one of the 3. She's amazing.
Yeah. So I want to ask this question about sort of activism. And so we've talked about sort of the need to use our scholarship to help advance humanity and to, in particular, help to advance marginalized communities. And at the same time, we talked about other pressures. There's the pressure of life. There's the pressure to publish. Mm-hmm. Is it okay to say, I can't write that strategic plan for this organization? Is it okay to say, I'm not going to that protest today because seriously, I got to go write my conference paper, or I have to write this book chapter, or I have to write this journal article? And then how do you respond to that? Because it must pull at your heartstrings when there is an action that you can't be involved in because the job makes you want to do that. I mean, I can tell you, I remember being told in annual reviews, they were less worried about me being actively involved in stuff. They were more worried about me being involved in pop stuff. So hint, hint, you write something for The Atlantic, it does not count, right? Like, even if it has an impact, yeah. So like, how do you deal with those pressures? Because those are real.
I remember, I just really quickly, and I want other folks, I don't want to monopolize, but for me, it was because of the stuff in 2017 in Charlottesville was so intense that we had a white supremacist torch rally in May, we had a Klan rally in June, a small one, we had a bigger Klan rally in July, and then we had the largest white nationalist rally in the history of the modern US in August. And there was no way I was gonna sit any of that out. Yep. I just felt like, I really felt that I had to do something so that my kids would not be saying something when they were in their late 40s, saying I had to go disrupt a Klan rally, or I have to go out there and tell Nazis that they're not welcome in my community. And it was awful. There was nothing glamorous about that, nothing. And I was there when that car came through, and like I can't even look at the photographs. And we woke up screaming for weeks. It was awful. And I still feel like that was an essential contribution. And I remember getting into an argument with the provost. And he wanted to have this event that would pull people away from going to the protests and come to campus, where he could create a safe environment to have a discussion about race. And I said, I'm not doing it. I refuse to do it, and you shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
No one should participate in that. We need people down there. What are you doing? This is an illusion. And they ended up, of course, having a state of emergency. They shut down the event. That event never happened. And later, he told me, he was like, you were right. And I was like, I know that. But really, this is someone who's at the high level and stuff, but saying they're safe. And I guess everyone has to assess their own level of risk. And that was risky, But it just seemed to me like something I was doing for my family in the same way that I would volunteer for the PTO bake sale, for the same way I would help raise money for the PTO or whatever. And so for me, and I guess, of course, it was the summertime, and there's been some things that I couldn't go. Well, I'm sorry, I can't go to court. I can't go to court today because I teach on Tuesday, Thursday, and court starts here, but I'll go for half a day, or I can come in the morning, and then I can whatever. Try to make it work. But I think for things that were so intense, I don't know, I just felt like, and that's how I felt at the time. I felt like it was an urgency. I just couldn't let them come to my town and let fascists just take over. And so many people had been trying to incorporate what they were doing as just free speech. I'm like, you are eroding the character of democracy by saying that Nazis have as much right to it as everybody else. That makes no sense. So that's just my take.
Rafa?
You mentioned risk, and something that really interests me in my work is our concept of risk, right? How when we measure something risky, it's really in relation to our self-interest, right? Like, what are we going to get out of it? And then something could be really high risk or low risk. And so, I get that from a lot of the literature I've read, but I want to also challenge this idea of risk and the way we see it. And and I'll be honest with you. And majority of my understanding of an alternative idea of risk comes from women of color feminist theory, specifically coming from the writers of This Bridge, right? Where they're kind of we're talking about risk where, yes, we're gonna lay our body for this vision, but it's a collective, right? So risk being something that's more out of the collective, like communal, relational. And so I think at this level, and I think probably when I was younger, that's how I was making my choices around and I think right now it's about, I'm gonna, work on this article instead of perhaps working on this project for this organization. But even back 10 years ago, I could have told you, it was me attending a board meeting for the county or me actually helping these undocumented youth activists, right, do civil disobedience.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I wasn't at that board meeting, right? Because again, I learned a different understanding of the collective.
So I'm going to ask you a final question, and then I'm going to open it up for audience questions. If there was any piece of advice that you would give your younger self about balancing your scholarship, your commitment to your communities, and activism, what advice would you give yourself?
I think, first of all, I'm thinking about what was my journey. I think I made the right decisions at the right times. I had a lot of angst in graduate school and even starting on the tenure track about where to put my energies and when, and I think so. I have always written and done research on things that were of immediate interest to me, and I've tailored my research interests to align with the political urgencies that I have. So in that regard, I'm not I'm not being pulled in some direction to do some, answer some inane question. So that's good. But where I have had, I had to be strategic or at least to not be naive that there were going to be people who were going to be judging me about the choices that I made. So when my co-author and I decided to write this book, which is it is an unorthodox type of book. It is not a typical academic book, and that it is my first book as an untenured person. I realized this, first of all, that having the opportunity to write this book was never a given by a university press. So yes, we're gonna do it. The moment is absolutely right, because the moment was yesterday. We're gonna do it. And this is why I got the PhD to begin with, was to, to the point that you were saying, right, of having that doctor, that PhD, that somebody who may not have been willing to listen to the thing is gonna bend their ear a little bit more. We're gonna do this. We wrote the book that we wanted to teach. And we wrote the book that we wanted to be in conversation with others. And the tenure vote still has not happened yet. So I'm going on my gut here that I did the right thing, because I also know that life is short and it can be taken from you at any moment, and when you have, especially, it's one thing, right, to look at what happens in the world on the news and the precarity of all kinds of lives, right? But then when you have people in your own life who they're gone in a moment, for whether because it was an act of violence or it's because it was some random ass thing that happened to them. Like, I need to live my life, and I wanted to write this book with my friend at this time. That was the right decision. And if this doesn't work out for me at the tenure vote, I'm gonna have to figure out the next step. And that will probably scare the crap out of me.
But you will.
But I guess I'll have to do it. You know what I mean?
And you're equipped to do it.
I'm gonna have to do that and figure out other ways to do things in my life. But I did this. So I think I did the right thing. I think I had good people in my life steering me. And yeah, there was always, this PhD wasn't just about an honor,
Right.
an honorific. It was to do something with it. So I'm doing it. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
I would say to my younger self, a lot of times you're going to think that what you need is a roadmap, but what you really need is a compass.
Nice. That's beautiful.
And think hard about what makes you happy, because happiness is a compass.
I know, right? I'm taking notes.
I'm gonna go get a compass.
I know. Oh my goodness, so it's my turn. I'm taking notes. I'm not gonna remember. And luckily we're recording this just for us, so I can get on record who you were talking about. I think what I would tell myself, in addition to not coloring my hair in 2014, I would say no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And I feel like I still have this tendency to want to fix it. My mother's always telling me that I think my whole life she's been telling me, Lisa, you can't do it all. You can't be at all the meetings. You can't do all the things. You can't, you can't pull it all by yourself, kind of thing. And so I think the truth of that is that allowing other people to fill in gaps. And if things don't get done as well as you would have liked it, oh well, that's okay. And that's something that I have been able to do, is to pull back and to let other people lead. And something that yesterday I was at a conference for legal aid advocates in Virginia and was talking about the Media Collective. And I said, when I enter any organizing space, my PhD does not matter. That it has no power there, and I never bring it into the fore. I never think about an organizing space as I would a classroom, right? Particularly coming from the University of Virginia and being in Charlottesville, and UVA being an institution that's been very harmful to the local communities. And so for me, it's about learning and listening and thinking about, what am I doing and who am I doing it for? And letting that be a kind of a compass, so to speak.
So part of my work is you know, I've been fortunate enough to work with organizational archives, you know, especially like grassroots nonprofit, and help them archive their materials. And I'm just thinking about like all the movements or work I've been a part of, and I felt like I would have told my younger self, like, Rafa, just document everything. Like, keep that flyer.
Oh, yeah.
Also buy a camera, because I didn't have a camera. And I try to remember, like, what did we do in 1998 or like
my gosh.
in 2003? And like, damn, that was tight. But then I try to capture it, like I go online or Google, but like, you know, it's not on there.
Right, that's
and
right.
then I know that my friend does have a picture. So I would say,
Yeah.
get yourself a camera, Rafa, invest in that camera. Like, it should be a good camera.
Good one.
And replaceable camera, because just like my beanies, I probably will lose it. And document all these special moments and being together with people, and just, yes, and then collect things, you know, for yourself or for other people.
Yeah, that's great.
So I tell a story in my book about a man named Leonard Matlovich, who was a veteran of the Vietnam War from the United States Air Force. And Matlovich outed himself to his superiors because he wanted to prove that you could be a patriot,
Yes.
you could be a distinguished member of the military and be gay, and all of those things could be compatible. And he was dishonorably discharged. So in the book, I have a picture of his headstone, which says, the military gave me a medal for killing 2 men and discharged me for loving 1.
Oh.
And that was such a powerful story for me to include in the book. And so what I would tell my younger self is to know your worth.
Yes.
Because that worth cannot be defined by any organization, institution, or title that you may hold.
Yes.
So I'd like to open this up to audience questions. We just want to make sure for the videotape that we make sure that we can hear this. So if everyone who wants to ask a question is actually willing to line up here, I'm going to turn my microphone your way so that you can ask a question. I'm going to invoke Black church rules, which means if it gets too long, I might take the mic back. So make sure that your question is a question and that your question is short.
Have that in all faculty meetings. That wasn't even a question, man.
So any questions? Feel free.
Hello, as Dr. Gillespie said, I'm one of the JWJI fellows for this year. I'm doing a PhD in English at Vanderbilt. And one question I had was, how did each of you sort of find your mentors and people who helped you to sort of connect with the professional spaces that you're in now? Because I study HBCUs in literature and culture, and I'm working on a project where I'm talking to different HBCU presidents, and I started about 2 summers ago, and I just cold called each of them, and a lot of them were really gracious with their time. But it was a bit nerve-wracking because it was talking to people in such higher up administration, and I didn't have a lot of connections. I just randomly emailed the email addresses that were online. So how did you make those connections?
And I think I would just add, there's no reason to think that even if you had a faculty mentor that knew all about different HBC cultures, that that process would be any different. You know, and so I found mine through. I just asked her if she'd be willing to mentor me. She taught at the school where I went to undergrad, and so that's how we got connected.
I think you should think about having different mentors for different reasons. Because the mentor that you need now as a graduate student will be different from the mentor or the type of mentoring you will need when, as I did a week into my job, called my dissertation advisor and said, why didn't you tell me that being a professor was going to be like this? And he laughed like, oh, Miss Brown Dean, if I told you, you never would have went into the academy. It's like, you know me so well. For me, going to conferences, and I'm an introverted person, it makes me so uncomfortable. I hate the gaze of conferences where people look at your name tag. You're never going to pronounce my name correctly looking at the name tag. So really, you're looking at institutional affiliation. So all of that bothers me. But the kind of informal mentoring that can happen in a conference lobby, or someone asks you, tell me what you're working on. Oh, do you know my friend is at this school, you should talk to this person.
Yes.
You know, you're interested in HBCUs. So I could say to you, oh, you should call my friend Jamal Watson, who's editor and works with all of these HBCUs across the country. So that's what mentoring is. I went in with the idea that mentoring was this formal process where we meet twice a week and you give me what I need to do. And if I just follow the steps, everything will be okay. Because what you also realize is that sometimes the people you thought would be your best mentor, maybe not. Or they served a particular purpose and now it's time to grow somewhere else.
Just to talk about the whole mentor question, like I actually ended up going to UCLA because I wanted to work with somebody who like wrote like the first book on like Chicanas in like the Chicano movement, right? And Chicano feminism and you know, so I was like, she's legit, that's the person I'm gonna work with. She's gonna give me my framework, she's gonna give me everything, right? And then I got that phone call from her, like, you've been admitted. I'm like, damn, this was meant to be. She was not my advisor. She was in my chair. And who was actually somebody else who gave me the structure and gave me kind of like, you know, the guidelines, right? And allowed me to move around, right? And that's what I needed. And that's what I ended up finding out after my first year. And then I started just bringing in people who I knew like, oh, you definitely give me that framework that I need, right? And then just started building relationships because surprisingly enough, so I had all these years of organizing experiences, talking to like, you know, key stakeholders and you know, from all different ages and everything like that, right? But in the academy, like, I just didn't have that type of networking skill. Like, I just didn't want to network with academics. So when I would go to conferences, because, you know, it was like, I didn't go to my first academic conference till like my third year. Because one, I was avoiding them. And then when I was there, I felt so weird. Because then I'd go to panels and then I'd be like, this is not what I'm into. Like, I literally went to American Political Science Association and I tweeted something and Lisa Bedoya Garcia was like, it gets better, Rafa, stay with us. And because I was like, I'm never coming to poli-sci again. And she's like, stay. So yeah, so just to give you an idea of just like my relationship even within academic spaces.
I feel like I've been really fortunate that, you know, people, like the very first person who kind of like spotted me in the classroom because, you know, I asked a certain type of question and then said, you know, kind of like, you know, in your experience, you sound like, you know, you might be going down this road, right? Because I didn't know I was going down that road. I don't even know if I was on that road at all. So I've been very blessed in that regard. And then these networks, these pipeline organizations, I have been fully surrounded, I believe, in these pipeline organizations. IRT, I was also, right? Ralph Bunche, Ford Foundation, it's a super duper blessing because and it's so necessary. So many of the people who you're going to meet who are people of color in the academy have had maybe at least one, and some of these people have like 5, right? Yeah. And it's been through that lens where I've created the networks. And I should also say that going to the conferences for me, because I was that undergrad standing by a poster in the conference room and maybe like 10 people came into the room, you know, the people who did come into the room, I knew that they were some kind of ally or some kind of interested person. And when I went to the caucus meetings, again, a smaller group of people, but they showed up at the caucus meetings because they understood there's an affinity here, right? So sometimes those people are like, they might be more interested in doing a little extra work, right? To be part of the, you know, the whole Sankofa type of situation, right? Let's bring people through. And so those people are probably your friendliest people. And then it's, you know, I think you go from there. I think the informality of it, I think is important. Having the different people is definitely important. People who you are not directly tied to are very valuable because of power dynamics, because they are locked into other networks. And also, outside of your discipline. Yeah. Get that outside of your discipline people. Because they bring a whole different thing to the table. So, yeah, that's enough. I don't have much.
David, do you have
I'm
any?
good.
So while we wait for more questions, I do want to sort of ask something about inverting power. So we've all talked about the privilege that we have of having PhDs, and oftentimes that gets our foot in the door. But then how do you invert power, or how do you make sure that when you enter a space, particularly an activist space with people who have, deep, intimate knowledge of their lives and their world, that you don't come in with sort of the presumption that, well, I have a credential, therefore I can tell you what to do?
So I'll start there. It's always been my experience with activists that they'll let you know, what you are not qualified to do, right? If you have that, you need to check yourself. But if you do have that presumption, they'll let you know right quick that's not going to fly. That has been my experience. Others may have had very different experiences there. But generally, I have found that, people who are really about that life, who are doing that stuff, they appreciate what you can bring to the table, but, their understanding of what that is and your understanding of what that is can be quite different at times, and they'll let you know what the difference is. And that's as they say, a negotiation.
And that's something I think is so useful for me. It's like approaching these situations with humility and everybody having the same goal. Like when we're sitting in all these, everyone has their phone in the microwave, and everyone's got like all of these things, that we do to kind of keep as safe as possible from other surveillance. Everybody is there for the same reason. Everybody's, and we've done some really great, campaigns that way about like, well, here's the objectives and here's what the talking points might be and who can do this and who can do that. And it's really about the skills you bring to the table. And a PhD is not a skill, yo. Like, it is not a skill. It's a credential, but it's not a skill. And so I really feel like that's one of the advantages that I've learned in various organizing spaces that I've been fortunate enough to participate in, is that everybody is, that people are good at certain things and they step forward, and we are, we try to be transparent and honest and listen and ask questions when you don't understand something. But nobody seems to come in there with, at least again in my experience, this is what we are going to do, here is how it is going to happen, because that's just replicating, we're trying to dismantle these racist and toxic systems. Why would we bring that into the organizing space? That's just, we're poisoning ourselves from within. It does mean that meetings are so freaking long. Like, I really think the key to liberation is apparently meetings. There's so many, and they take a long time. I thought faculty meetings were long, but I was wrong. Like you go in the meeting and it's daylight, and you come out and it's nighttime. And I'm like, aren't we free yet? Shit, But, but I think that humility, and I don't think that that's that hard. I just don't think that's that hard. Though, everybody gets something different out of their credential, but I never got this feeling like, ooh, I'm so, so special or whatever.
I feel like what a PhD is to me is I know a lot about this much, right? And I try to explain it to my students too, because they come at you with this sense of veneration, and it's like, okay, but what do you know? Like, things too, right?
Yes,
I know a lot about this much. What do you know a lot about, right? And if we bring that into spaces where, again, I'm not I used to be a little bit of an organizer. I'm not now, right? Some of my activism is actually probably happening in class where we're doing things, but like that, I think that's a really easy way for me to remind myself what it is that I know or what I can bring to the table. It's this, and then, somebody else brings theirs, so you just bring your piece.
I'm excited. So next semester, I'm teaching a class on immigration policy, and I'm so excited because, last week I was presenting at another conference called the Association of Joteria Studies. Joteria means like, it's like for Latinas, Latino, Latinx people, it means queer trans, right? So jotos, jotas, right? So I was at this conference and I was meeting with the organization that I do consulting with, and I was like, you know what? Like, my class is just gonna work on your campaign for 4 months next semester.
Oh, nice.
And so, like, from the get-go, like, they're gonna learn about U.S. immigration policy, but at the same time, we're gonna get down with you. Like, this is how they're gonna earn their grade, right? And we were just so excited because I feel, I feel in doing so, you know, I feel like we are, in multiple ways, we're inverting power, like within the institution, especially using the resources of the institutions, right? Using their resources in order to support this organization that's doing amazing work. And so I'm really excited about that, and hope to write about something about that too as well.
Hi, thank you all for being here. Rafa, you actually started speaking to my question, which was about what are some of the ways that you engage or promote student activism and organizing in the classroom and through your campuses?
I have a story that I think I thought it was funny during the time, and I still think it's kind of funny. When I was in a political science department, and I was at a very, very white school at Ohio University, I don't even remember what the name of this class was. It was a very like entry level kind of political science thing. And so I had a bunch of freshmen, and you know, they had all kind of different ideas what their politics were. So I'm like, well, how are we going to do a thing together? Right? How are we going to pick this collective thing we're going to do together? Because I wanted them to have that experience. And so they had to have that conversation with each other of like, well, what do we agree on? Now that right there was its own very interesting process, because some of them weren't even, you know, political at all, right? I mean, they were just like, I signed up for this class, right? So you know, they started putting out different ideas, and they couldn't agree on anything except for the idea that puppy mills were a bad idea.
Oh.
I said, and I did not want to poo-poo this, so I was like, okay, what can you do as a class about this? Right? Well, we could raise awareness. I'm like, okay, well, that also means you have to educate yourself on what a puppy mill is and where they are. And so they started doing this work little by little, right? And then they got like this organization to come and like bring puppies, and they had this thing on campus.
Oh my gosh.
And like they started talking about puppy mills. And I was like, you know what? Like, this is happening like at the same time that like the Million Hoodie March is like, right, it's like happening. So I'm like, right, this is not urgent to me in a particular way, but it's something for them, right? They're actually cutting their teeth here. And I was like, okay, let's support this. So if you like Google my name, right, and you know, you're searching, you will see a picture of a bunch of students by a wall that they painted that says like, save the puppies. And they're there, but it's something that 25 students could agree on who didn't have any kind of sense of politics, but they started doing things, and that meant that they had to get organized and be like, well, okay, I have class then, when can you go over to that place, right? And it was those like logistical pieces of like how you work as a group. And I'm like, you know what? That was valuable.
Yeah.
It wasn't like my screaming topic, but they learned something. And so that's like one end. I'm sure everybody else has like another story, but that was like a story that I have. It's not the only one, okay, but it was one.
Save the puppies.
It probably won't shock you to know that in a business school, we don't do a lot of that. But what I'd say is I've been very proud at moments. So in my class, so I teach the introductory marketing class. Like that stuff is pretty standard. We're going to learn about the 4 Ps this semester, and here we go. But I do try to hand them a set of skills that help them with critical thinking, and I do push a lot of social marketing stuff. So organizations that are trying to do work around getting people out to vote or promoting safe sex, you know, things like that that are, you know, pretty straightforward, though for some of them that borders on radical, right? And so, you know, a couple of times on campus since I've been teaching that class, we have had fairly large-scale student protests, most recently over the hiring of our new president. And I have found much to my great pleasure, that a number of my students have been involved in those sorts of things. So these kinds of things, like they matter actually quite a bit. To me, it's obvious how you could start with puppy mills and work from there. Like, it's a concrete context there is exploitation of a kind, right? Like, and they can look at that, think critically about it, and begin to move and develop an analysis from there.
Can I just ask what the 4 Ps are? Let me tell you what I guessed. Is it price, profit, product, and propaganda? Did I get any of them right?
Yeah, that's actually fairly close.
Did I get any of them right? Did I get 2 right?
1, 2.
The 3 right?
Yes.
What? I could have been a business professor, y'all. But no.
I always tell my students that in marketing, you only get to play with 4 things. You can play with the product.
Okay.
You can play with the price.
Okay.
You can play with place or distribution. And you can play with promotion, or what you call
Propaganda.
which is the same thing, actually.
It was gonna drive me bananas because I'm not the kind of person that can leave something like that on the table. I'm like, he said it was 4 things. What was it? Well, no one's gonna talk about it, no one's gonna follow up. Like, no one else was curious. I had to know. Okay.
And that's no matter what kind of organization you are, what you're doing. Those are the 4 things that if you're running it, you're an organizer or you're a CEO, those are the 4 things you get to play with. That's it.
Nice, thank you.
So we have time for one more question.
Is this how you spell
If anybody has it. Yes, please feel free to come forward.
In Charlottesville, have you noticed whether or not there are any observable indicators that would tell you that certain white students will become good allies for social justice, in contrast to the opposite indicators that some white students will not become good advocates for social justice?
That's a great question. Just for the mic, I'll repeat it. The question was, have I been able to notice at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville if the events of August 2017 in particular have created a sense of allyship among white students, either good allyship or bad allyship? It's really difficult to say. I think it's hard for me actually to answer that question because I'm not that focused on it. I think what I'm mostly focused on is questions of university accountability as structural accountability, which I think the university is definitely working on. They've created a lot of different institutes and different groups. We now have an equity center that's partnering with the community of Charlottesville to kind of help repair some of the harm, structural, deep-seated harm. You know how universities work, right? There's some land there, they take it, people used to live there, now there's a building that the school owns. Like these kind of policies. I had a really fantastic class right after the events of August of 2017. After the car attack, I was expected to teach like 10 days later, and it was a nightmare. But the class I taught, Race, Racism, Colony, and Nation, was really a dream. It was a really great class. And I got the sense that I would ask the students, like, why are you here? Why did you choose this? And they would say, there's no better time than now to take a class like this. And so I would like to think that, particularly with a recent statement that we're trying out, I was part of this initiative to create a new college curriculum for new undergraduate general education requirements. And the Student Council recently endorsed that program because of its novelty, because of its newness, because of the ways that it pulled together different categories of understanding, that I think that they want to be different. Now, it's hard to say. I mean, that UVA is still a majority white, it's still a PWI. And I think where I tend to draw my attention is on the folks that are already doing the work. Those are the ones that I just tend to see more of. We've got some really great student organizers throughout the university that are working for changes in a variety of ways. But I don't consider, I think it would be nice to think that since that horrible event of August 2017 was orchestrated by University of Virginia graduates, I think that there's this narrative that Charlottesville was invaded by white supremacists who came outside. That is not true. One of the main organizers graduated from UVA, and one of the headliners, Richard Spencer, is a graduate of the University of Virginia. And so, as I say about the torch rally, was this an invasion or was it a homecoming? And that if you look at UVA's history, that we were the architects of the eugenics movement. The Tuskegee experiments probably could not have happened had it not been for the training of eugenicists at the University of Virginia. So we have been an engine for white supremacist thought, racism, segregation, all of that. And so it seems like, for me, that type of accountability is that much more powerful than, I think that it's going to be a lot of things that might require white people to divest themselves of the power, the seductive, illusory power of whiteness. But I think even if that doesn't happen, I think the institutions have a responsibility to think about their whole history. And I do believe that UVA is taking some of those steps. I don't know if that's answering.
Khalilah, did you still want, so just so you know, 3 of us are UVA undergrad alumni, and so, yeah, so we all, and one of the things that I can say, going back to Charlottesville quite a bit, is you can look at the signage on doors, especially on the lawn, which is mostly white, and it's sort of, the place to live in your last year. That signage has changed, and it's actually still the same. I could walk on the lawn today, and you could see people who are trying to, at least in a symbolic way, demonstrate their allyship. So.
And we've got we have a new monument to enslaved workers that's being built and meant to be unveiled in April of 2020. And I think, though, it's also worth asking, is white allyship the pinnacle? Is that the goal? And I have a friend that says, I don't want allies, I want accomplices. Right? That it's not enough just to be not racist, that you have to be kind of actively anti-racist. And so, this is what we need in order to help dismantle these systems. So we can try to dismantle them structurally, but we could also, the interpersonal stuff, that's a different, I think it's a different conversation. Yeah. But it seems important to me to think that this conversation doesn't begin and end with whether white students are less racist than they used to be. I think that it has to be a different set of questions.
Yeah.
So I'll just say quickly, back in 2015, Professor Gillespie and I were in Selma, Alabama. That was an experience, for the Bloody Sunday anniversary and to talk about our report on the Voting Rights Act. 2 weeks later, I got called to Charlottesville because at the time, current UVA student named Martise Johnson had been slammed to the ground by an alcoholic beverage control officer. Right, that's what we call them in Virginia, the ABC officer, had been slammed to the ground. His head was burst open, bleeding profusely. He was handcuffed and hogtied before they would allow a paramedic to investigate him. The officer had alleged that he had used a false ID. The bar owner said absolutely not. So we were called that very night and ended up coming down a couple days later and leading a group of alumni to organize around the country. So these things had been festering and brewing for quite some time. And I think, to bring together the last question and then your question, I teach a class this semester called Power, Politics, and Punishment. And I have my students, they group themselves and then they study different issues and they come up with an actionable project. And I can tell you that when we started this class, there were students who said, I'm only here because it fit my schedule. I'm only here because I don't like to take a class before 8 a.m. That's fine. Those same students have come to me in tears over this last 2 weeks, asking me, how is it that a man could be sitting in his home eating ice cream and die, and someone get 10 years for that? And I'm a big sports person. And then I tell them, well, think about Plaxico Burress, who shot himself and did more time for shooting himself than this woman will. And so our students are paying attention and they're aware and they're not sure how to process it. Because what they've been told their whole lives is if you do the right thing, you don't do anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about, right? You get pulled over, as long as you're not riding dirty, you're okay. And so it is a shock to them now to see all the things that they were taught growing up isn't really the case for other people. For me as a professor, it is a powerful moment to teach in the aftermath of the murder of Tatiana Jefferson, the sentencing of Amber Geiger, on the precipice of an historic impeachment investigation. So to me, that activist scholarship is being in a classroom and saying to students, I'm not here to tell you how to think. I don't get any extra points if you agree with me. My job is to challenge you to think critically and to figure out when you go out into the world as an entrepreneur or as a correctional officer or as a teacher or as a bus driver, what is it that you're taking with you to kind of have that out? And that's where I see students grappling with and figuring out their place in the world.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So that's a great note to end on. So please join me in thanking this panel.
Thank y'all. Great job, beautiful.